What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, I thought we could do something a little different than normal. So we're gonna take a look at how air ambulances are set up in the United States, specifically helicopters. Now, this is an often confused subject, which is understandable as there are so many different delivery models of helicopter EMS. So stick around and we'll get into it in just a moment on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, I think we will get into the deep history of air ambulances, or we might say helicopter EMS, or for purposes of this video, just HEMS. We'll get into the deep history in another video, but it is important to note that many of the HEMS systems in the United States actually began with large hospitals. Hence, our first model in the system is the hospital-based system. These hospital-based systems themselves can even be split up into different models, but the most common model that was formed way back in the 1970s and early 1980s is a system where the hospital is their own operator and all of the employees work for the actual hospital. Now, these hospitals largely function with many departments that you guys know about, or units, some people might say, such as the intensive care unit or the surgical unit or the emergency department. Well, when these systems started many decades ago, many of them began as an extension of the emergency department at that particular hospital. This is because the typical type of patient that was being transported back then were trauma patients that were picked up from the scene, whether it was a highway accident or a shooting victim or someone out in the wilderness or something like that who was injured while rock climbing. There were very few inter-facility transfers way back at the beginning. Well, now, we have known for quite a long time that the quicker you get a major trauma patient to a hospital, and more specifically to surgery, the better chance they have at survival. Now, do not confuse that with what you may have heard is called the golden hour, as the golden hour is a complete fallacy lacking any sort of scientific data to support it at all. Don't believe me? You tell me your reasons below why you think the golden hour is a real thing, and maybe I'll respond with a video all on its own. Nonetheless, when HEMS first got started, it was mainly for transporting major trauma patients back to the emergency department. Many of the hospitals hired their own pilots. They bought or leased their own helicopters and hired their own nurses and paramedics, most of whom would work in those same roles in the actual emergency department, though, when they were not out on a flight. Now, many of the larger systems across the United States started out this way. Now, some of these systems may have begun with smaller aircraft like Bell 206s, but most of them ended up with larger aircraft that could accommodate a full-sized ambulance stretcher to be loaded in the rear with airframes like the BK-117 or BO-105. You know, with technically the first civilian helicopter air ambulance being Flight for Life out of St. Anthony Hospital in Denver, Colorado, with their super cool Alouette 3. Now, over the years, these same flight services also began doing critical care transfers from smaller rural hospitals where they would transfer critical trauma and medical patients, and also specialty care patients like high-risk OB moms and itty-bitty little neonate transfers, which require an isolette or an incubator, as we used to call them. Now, these transfers really started to elevate the expectations on the level of care provided by the flight nurses and the flight paramedics. The call volume started to increase dramatically, and sooner or later, it became increasingly more difficult for an emergency department management staff to manage the clinical aspects of patient care with medical direction and the paramedics and the nurses, while somehow also having the expertise and experience to manage the pilots and the mechanics and everything that goes with managing a Part 135 operator certificate from the FAA. And so many hospital-based systems back in the 80s eventually started to sort of defer to expertise and would hire experienced operators to run the aviation side of things, with some popular ones being CJ Systems and especially Rocky Mountain Helicopters was a big one. Now today, this is by far the most popular popular and common version of the hospital-based system, with services out there such as the University of Wisconsin's MedFlight. They have a physician-based program where they fly Airbus EC-145s with physicians and nurses on board, but with Metro Aviation as their air operator. Or the great system down at the University of Mississippi where they fly both EC-145s and EC-135s with flight nurses and paramedics who are employed by the hospital, with their operator being Medtrans, which is a part of the GMR family. Or out east at Vanderbilt Life Flight in Tennessee, who fly EC-145s, EC-135s, and also EC-130s, which also has paramedics and nurses employed by the hospital, and the operator in that case is Air Methods. Or Air Kids 1 right here in Oklahoma City, who flies an EC-135 where the operator is PHI, with the med crew being employed by the hospital. Now, that Air Kids 1 here in OKC is another sort of branch of hospital-based, in that they specialize in neonatal, pediatric, and high-risk OB transfers, and they don't do any scene flights or trauma. Now, the overwhelming majority of hospital systems now utilize this model where the operator is a larger aviation company with the med crew being employed by the hospital, but there are actually a couple systems that still exist, such as Aeromed from Spectrum Health Hospital System up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the hospital system owns their own Part 135 FAA certificate, and everybody from the med crew to the pilots to the mechanics all work and are employed by the hospital, and they fly this super cool Sikorsky S-76. Now, historically, for the most part, many of these hospitals would have maybe one or two helicopters that would be based at the actual hospital that owned them. For instance, Tulsa Life Flight here in Oklahoma, up in Tulsa, where I used to work, back in the day had several BK-117s that would be based out of St. Francis Hospital up in Tulsa. They would receive calls all across the eastern half of Oklahoma and would fly out to the patient, pick them up, and bring them back to St. Francis Hospital. Well, I live here in the United States, and we have this amazing thing here called capitalism and the free market, which eventually led people to create their own business model that involved placing helicopters out into the actual community where they would be much closer to the actual people who needed the helicopters in the first place, with the thinking being that if the people out in the communities needed a helicopter, there would already be one there and would cut the transport time in half, as they would not have to wait the time for a helicopter to arrive from the hospital itself. However, like I said, many of the hospitals had much larger airframes, with many utilizing the BK-117 or the BO-105, but others also using the Dauphine AS-365s or Bell 222s or 230s, or even a couple of them flying the Bell 412. Well, many of those helicopters that I just mentioned cost $7, $8, $9, $10, $15 million, which many of the hospitals could afford because they were bringing the majority of their patients back to their own hospitals and would make up the expensive cost of the big helicopters with the revenue generated from surgeries and intensive care stays by those patients. Well, this really would not be a feasible business model for someone wanting to start a private business for air ambulances out in the communities, and hence the common practice of placing much smaller, lighter, and single-engine aircraft out into the communities eventually gave birth to our second model of HEMS, which is called Community-Based Services, or sometimes just called CBS. Now, throughout the 1990s, these CBS aircraft were placed into the smaller communities, mostly out here in the American Midwest, by some smaller companies, at least at the time, like Air Evac Life Team, Air Methods, Medtrans, OmniFlight, EagleMed, and on and on and on. Now, the majority of these aircraft were either Bell 206s or Aerospatiale AS-350s, which then changed to Eurocopter and now Airbus. Now, from a business standpoint, this community-based model simply blew up the air ambulance industry in the United States, as the rural EMS agencies, the fire departments, and more importantly, the rural hospitals all loved the idea of being able to call a helicopter to either respond to their scene or respond to their hospital, get the patient, and get out in a much shorter amount of time than waiting for the hospital-based systems to fly all the way out to them. So these bases just began to pop up everywhere across the Midwest and rural parts of the country. And as time went by over the next 20 or 30 years and throughout the 1990s and all the way up till today, more and more bases were created, while at the same time, many of the mom and pop HEM services started to kind of merge with each other or to be acquired by other agencies until we get to the point where we are today, where really there's 3 or 4 big companies that own and operate the majority of the community-based systems, with Air Methods owning hundreds of bases. GMR, which includes services like Air Evac Life Team, MedTrans, EagleMed, and Reach, just among others, they have hundreds of bases across the country, and PHI owning dozens as well across the middle part of the country. Now, yes, there are still some mom and pop style community-based services still out there, such as Survival Flight, but the majority of them are owned by a much larger parent company. Now, again, here in the United States, with capitalism comes the free market, and with the free market comes competition. These community-based systems flourished because of their quicker response times, heavy marketing, and their successful reimbursement rates also, but that flourishing also meant heavy competition for the larger hospital-based systems. Now, some of the hospital-based systems followed suit and started to place their own helicopters out into the communities.
All the staff from the paramedics to the nurses, pilots, and mechanics will work for Air Methods.
That still makes them a hospital-based system or maybe kind of a hybrid, but they just placed some of their aircraft out into the communities and didn't stop the way that they hired their people in having med crew employed by the hospital.
One thing won't change. St. Francis Hospital will still be the home base of Tulsa Life Flight, even though most of the equipment and personnel will be out in the surrounding communities.
But for many of the hospital-based systems, this competition just proved too much for their bottom line and eventually led to hospitals not only handing over their operator responsibilities like they did back in the 80s to a bigger company, but also eliminating their hospital-based med crew and deferring those folks also over to the major operators like Air Methods or GMR. And those two systems, hospital-based and community-based, make up probably 97% of all air ambulance operations here in the United States. However, there are some pretty cool systems that have their own unique way of doing things. For instance, there are several versions of nonprofit air ambulances here in the States. One version of a nonprofit is like what they do with Boston MedFlight, where yes, they are a nonprofit, but they are funded in a very unique way, which we call a consortium. Many of the bigger hospitals in the Boston area, they sort of join forces to help fund and utilize Boston MedFlight across the majority of New England. Now, in this case, Boston MedFlight is actually their own Part 135 operator, and they operate a super cool fleet of H-145D3 helicopters, a Cessna Citation fixed wing, and several large critical care ground ambulances. Now, another version of a nonprofit would be something like Mercy Flight, which operates a fleet of super cool Bell 429 helicopters across central New York. Now, this model actually has Mercy Flight's parent company, which is a for-profit company called EMS Air Services of New York, pay for the helicopter, and then the flight service itself survives off of insurance reimbursement and public and private donations. Now, there actually is another interesting nonprofit helicopter out there called Two Bear Air out of Montana, who also flies the super cool Bell 429, but they focus solely on search and rescue across Montana and Idaho and parts of Washington and Oregon, and managed to do so, I believe, being funded 100% by private donations. And they don't charge for their services. Now, they're not really an air ambulance, though, as they are not providing patient care, but I thought that what they do is super cool, so I wanted to mention them. And last but not least, you have the government-run helicopter services in certain parts of the country. Now, at the state level, you have a service like Maryland State Police with their amazing Augusta 139 program. Now, for Maryland State Police, they have 2 civilian pilots who fly these aircraft with 2 Maryland State Police officers in the back, who are also paramedics. Now, this service doesn't really do any interfacility transfers and instead focuses on search and rescue, law enforcement activities, and traumatic scene flights. Now, this service is funded primarily through license plate taxes, I believe, in Maryland, but they also have some direct funding that comes from the Maryland State Police budget. Now, you also have county services, with one of the more famous ones being Travis County EMS Starflight down in Austin, Texas, who flies the super cool Augusta AW169, which is just sort of a slightly scaled down version of the 139. Now, Travis County pretty much does it all with critical care, scene flights, search and rescue, as well as firefighting capabilities. Super cool service. Now, you also have a few city services, such as Los Angeles City Fire Department, who has several airframes in their fleet, including the new Bell 505 and the tried and true Bell 206. They use those for training and observation, but their workhorse is the Augusta 139, which doubles as both an air ambulance as well as a firefighting helicopter, and even has a nearly 500-gallon water tank attached to the bottom of the helicopter, which certainly was put to use in the recent fires that ravaged the communities throughout Los Angeles. So those are the primary delivery models of HEMS and air ambulances in the United States, with your hospital-based programs, community-based programs, nonprofits and consortiums, and finally the city, county, and state-run services. Now, this video is really about describing the different delivery models, and is not about which one of these models is best for the country or best for patient care or is the most efficient. But I am kind of curious, what do you think is the best model for delivery of out-of-hospital EMS in the United States? Let me know in the comments below, as this is a pretty contentious topic in different parts of the world, and I want to know what you think. Either way, regardless of which system we feel may be the better one or the right one, there are some huge items that all of these systems and services have in common, and that is that all of their pilots have put in thousands of hours of time throughout their careers just to be qualified enough to work in EMS. The mechanics at all these places all bust their ass every day to keep these aircraft flyable and safe. The flight nurses and the flight paramedics, for the most part, could all probably make the same amount of money, or maybe even more, and probably have a less risky career working in a hospital or on an ambulance, yet they all choose to work on these helicopters because when it comes time to help the sick and injured, they want to be the ones put under pressure. They want to be the ones to make these critical decisions. They want to be the ones to help and to make a difference and to make an impact in people's lives. And that same mindset exists on all of these helicopters, no matter which system they might work in. Now, I do always wait until the end of my videos to ask for a like and a subscription, because I feel it would kind of be unfair to ask for it up front. But if you felt that you enjoyed this content and you want to see more, click the buttons, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode.